Welcome to Shop Talk, everyone. I'm Brandi.
And I'm James, and we talk about all things related to cross-cultural workers and mental health.
Thanks for joining us, and welcome to Season 4.
We're excited to be here today to talk with Steph Schwarz about cross-cultural conflict. Brandi, tell us about Steph.
Steph, we're really happy to have you today. Steph Schwarz is a registered psychologist who has a special focus on providing resources and skills for cross-cultural workers. She served in the field for 5 years in Ethiopia and continues to provide care through a global role with her cross-cultural organization, SIM. Steph serves as the resilience consultant on the people development and care team, where she collaborates to provide support and resources to strengthen care for global workers. A major focus in her work in the past couple of years has been the introduction of peacemaking training to the organization. This training teaches a biblical approach to peacemaking, with an emphasis on developing awareness of the diverse worldviews that can be present on multicultural teams. And we can put a link for your training and the programs that you use whenever we release the podcast in the notes stuff. And again, we're going to talk about working on cross-cultural teams today. And it's a cross-cultural podcast today. So Steph is Australian. James and I are both Texans, so we're a little bit, I don't know whatever you say about Texans, but it's great to have you here. And multiple time zones. Steph woke up early. James is staying up late in Spain. And I'm doing great here. It's 4 p.m. Here in Texas.
Thanks, Brandi. It's so good to be joining you and James today. Yeah, and I've had great experiences with Texans, so it's a joy to join you.
Wonderful.
Hopefully I can take partial credit for that. Steph, why don't you tell us just a little bit about some of your exposure in especially cross-cultural teams and how you kind of came to where you've landed now and navigating resilience and kind of organization and peacekeeping and those kinds of things.
Yeah, sure, James. I'd love to. As Brandi mentioned in the intro, I've served for 5 years in Ethiopia. So that was a first point of exposure for me to cross-cultural teams and just seeing how people from different places come together and serve together and what that's like. One of the things that propelled me into cross-cultural work was just to see the joy of what it means to be a believer in a place that's outside my first culture. So I was actually really curious about that. But of course, there were some lessons along the way, and realizing that there are some very well-meaning and passionate people who come to ahead in the work that they're trying to achieve. And it was perplexing, just how can so much good intent go so wrong. And even as I first arrived, as I started to look back after the first few months, I realized I was walking in a milieu of inherited conflict, and you learnt to do things in certain ways, and there were rules or sensitivities you had to be alert to. And that got me thinking for a little while, what's going on, and how do I make sense of this as a person who's also trying to be faithful and also vulnerable to the same patterns and the limitations that we have.
Would you say spoken rules or unspoken rules?
Oh, there'd be both, I think.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, not a lot was made explicit, except if I really put my foot in it.
I imagine that would be interesting as a newcomer and experiencing some of the cultural tensions and ways that people have worked around them, and you're coming in and trying to perceive what's happening. Like, things are going on there, but you can't really put your finger on it right away. And I imagine that was interesting to work through.
Yeah, what I remember is in our preparation time for cross-cultural work, really being told over and over to look, listen, and learn. Don't come in hot and ready to go, but there's a lot going on that we'll need to absorb. So that's the heart posture that I strove to hold. But I realized after a while that I was inheriting some unhelpful postures. So I would sincerely try and follow what was happening, but it wasn't all good. And I didn't have the context to understand what I was inheriting. So one of the issues that came forward for me after the first few years was, how do we relate with local people, local believers? And the way that my organization was present, it really had quite colonialist roots, not in recent years, but there were things that, because people had come in humbly wanting to learn and follow the patterns of, what we were repeating wasn't good and wasn't what I had hoped our body to be reflecting in the way that we serve together. So I had a lot of internal conflict about that as well. So it really takes a long time to be wise and godly in how we integrate well, but then question and influence the context that we're serving in. And you can't do that early on and come out clean, and it's going to be pretty rocky.
And you're thinking about working on a team with different perspectives, and then
Mm.
as the target audience is going to be a different perspective and different worldview too. So there's a lot of worldviews swirling
Yeah.
around there that you're trying to take into account and respect.
Yeah, if I could say a little bit more about that, because this is getting to the crux of, I think, where we experience cross-cultural conflict in our teams, particularly in our organization, and maybe others as well, have a focus to be able to send from anywhere to anywhere. So the effect is that we will have cross-cultural teams working together. Now, the heart for us in that focus is that we're not trying to bring a gift from a superior culture to a more needy culture. What we have is the good news that we're in great need of God's rescue, that He's reached out to each one of us. And so that, therefore, as we cross barriers to reach people who've not yet received it, it's a message that we're responding to God's generous grace, and we're wanting to share that. And that's a fundamental framework, I think, for how we think about cross-cultural conflict, because I'm not wanting, or what I'm understanding is I don't see us bringing a superior message into a culture that needs to hear from my worldview, but I have a good news message to live out with people from a different perspective, and a lot to discover in that. So, as you've probably seen in cross-cultural ministry, the effect of having people come from everywhere to everywhere is that while we have a select group of people who are determined and convicted about what they're doing, each person has a different view about what is good, right, and godly. That is formed not only by the Bible, but actually by their own culture as well. And we're very well trained in some areas, but I'm not sure that people arrive into these cross-cultural contexts aware of their own cultural worldviews. And that's where I think a lot of the places where we trip over can come up. Until we've done the work. Once we can see the platform that we're standing on and the assumptions that are in that, then that's a really helpful way of being ready and equipped to connect and live out the gospel more fully, including in how we resolve conflict.
From my experience, a lot of times if we were to rank conflict from just horrible, awful, really high to kind of working it through on a day-to-day basis, it seems like some of the biggest conflicts most often happen from those who are expatriate in the culture in which they're living. And, we kind of see that in some of the attrition stuff, like one of the number one reasons people leave the field is interpersonal conflict. And a lot of times it's amongst the people who are coming into a place and trying to navigate being a part of a cross-cultural organization in addition to living cross-culturally.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, isn't there? When we bring worker or a worker unit into a new context, they've got a lot to learn. They've lost a lot of their resources and spaces for processing big questions and having to form that. And they're surrounded by other people who have their own tensions and newly formed resource networks as well. So even just from a sociological perspective, it's fraught with the likelihood that we'll be jamming up against each other.
Fraught. Yes, that's
Yes.
a good word for it. So what I'm hearing from both of you is there's a higher likelihood that the tension is going to be amongst the cross-cultural workers rather than toward the people you're working with. Like there's going to be misunderstandings and missteps there, but from what I see, I think I mentioned this before, we tend to give those relationships more grace. Like for instance, for example, like you were working in Ethiopia, and I imagine there that it would be easier to give grace in those relationships rather than with the other people coming from different cultures that you're working with.
Yeah, I think it certainly takes us more by surprise when assumptions, we're looking to the side and these are the people we're serving with and a part of our in-country support network, and they're so different to us. And then we're relying on a particular way of resolving an issue or making something happen, and it's so different. And how are you upset with me for the way I did that? Because all of a sudden I've offended someone without realizing. So one example would be I'm an Australian. And if you've looked at some of the scales of the different ways that we form assumptions in the world, the low power distance, high power distance assumption, Australians are very, very low. And so that means the way we make decisions and the way we form relationships on teams, it's very buddy like. I know who the team leader is and they have certain responsibilities, but they're with me and I can assume I can raise suggestions and speak into a decision very early. And so I have a tendency to jump in meetings and just contribute. And I'm aware that that's not the way that people see is polite or helpful in other team contexts. So I have to pull back.
Particularly in American context, that would be a very different, I think, normal expectation of engaging, and there's more of a hierarchy, I think, traditionally.
Yeah, that's right. There's a little bit more reverence or respect given to leaders. You certainly wouldn't tease them the same way that we do.
That's true.
Like we show that we really get along with you by really jamming you in the ribs with our humor. And
Just
see, we
laying into somebody.
yes, and the leader will be a target for that. And an American will get quite offended, possibly, if they're holding quite seriously the respect that their position should hold. There's not that much difference between Australian and Americans in power difference. If you look at the rest of the scale, there's German and South African who have a bit higher power distance. And then you get to Asia, where the role itself has so much esteem and honor, and there's much behavior and nuance around how to honor and respect that. If Australian doesn't get that, that's going to really jam up the relationship.
I think one of the parts that I really like that there's an Australian here is because I think we so often tend to kind of categorize Western, non-Western. And
Mhm.
it's just, we're just so much more nuanced in that dichotomy. Like we're just talking about one specific small aspect of leadership difference and team engagement between American and Australian. And actually it's a fairly significant difference from each other. And that's
Yeah.
what really matters. Not so much that we're both more Western or we're both, white European ancestry, but rather that where we stand culturally from each other, there's actually a really noticeable difference. And that's worth attending to.
Yeah, you're
I
describing
think,
quite significant that contributes to conflict because we assume we're similar. That's where the more heated conflicts
right.
can really pop out of nowhere. Yeah, so there's been a recognition. I think what we've already acknowledged is that there's a lot of conflict that almost predictably comes up when we're in a cross-cultural team and serving together. Part of it's sociological in origins, but of course we have spiritual warfare as well as a really significant part of that. And I was actually listening to your interview with Jeff Whiteman and thinking about how significant conflict is for causing missionary attrition. But that is not just what we're doing when we're looking at developing peacemaking, because when we're living out the peace of God, it's missional. We are living out what we want people to know about. And so we're attracting people by showing what the gospel looks like when we live well with one another. So it's a little bit reacting to decades of research that acknowledges how harmful unresolved conflict and ill-equipped people are. And there's now a term called conflict incompetence because it's such a significant issue. And so we're trying to address this issue of conflict incompetence. But really, as I've been involved in developing a program in our organization to build peacemaking practices, I'm really convicted by what we're doing is together learning how to be God's people and live out the pattern he's given us. I think part of the challenge is the Bible is a whole manual on peacemaking, and it's a lot to remember. So how do we together know the bits we need to know to do life well when we're in ministry together in these very enriched circumstances? Perhaps I can tell you about the program that I've had the pleasure of being involved in the last couple of years, because that's been quite an exciting part of my journey and seeing how we can be investing in our workers. It was actually quite a God moment. It was right at the beginning of the pandemic, January 2020, and there was some training that I wanted to go to called Peacewise, which was biblical peacemaking training. And this had a cross-cultural supplement added to it. And I went, oh, that sounds like it's relevant to my field. I'd love to go. And so I went in February. And then the next week, we had the beginning of all those lockdowns that rolled out across the world. And if I hadn't had gone then, it wasn't rolled out, like delivered again until I delivered it 3 or 4 years later. Yeah. So it was a really important moment in my journey, which I'm really grateful for in God's timing in that. So Peacewise training is based on a book called The Peacemaker by Ken Sande, which you've probably heard about. And I've noticed over the last 5 or 6 years, or even longer, there's many organizations whose training is strongly influenced by that book, The Peacemaker. He's put together some really helpful flows of how what we read in the Bible fit together in real life and some models in there. And so Peacewise, along with other organizations, have permission from Ken to deliver that training in their own frameworks. So I attended and really was quite moved by it and thought this really has a lot to offer. It's comprehensible and useful, and I love that it's this cross-cultural supplement. But then, of course, as we're entering this, God asks us to go through our own journey. So I needed to go through my own reflection. And what I love about Peacewise is it allows me to do my own heart work, because as each person takes on the training, they're thinking about what am I bringing into this conflict and how am I honoring God by the way that I respond. So, of course, when we experience conflict, we first come up with that jarring feeling, that's not right. Why are they doing it like this? And it really gives a bit of space for slowing down. And it's very formative from a spiritual perspective. So that took a couple of years because there was the coaching training as well. And then I got into conversations with the organization and was able to find out whether they were open to developing it further, because it just had a cross-cultural supplement. And this became later on a bit problematic because it was just a Western framework with a cross-cultural addition to it. And there'd be a more full expression of the gospel as we live it out in resolving conflict. We want to be hearing, well, how do you read the Bible and what does it tell you about how we restore relationships? So one teaching I might just mention as an example is we often go to Matthew 18, where Jesus is very clear. If you are aware of a brother's sin, go to them one-on-one. And then if they don't turn from what they're doing wrong, then bring some people with you and then go into the church. That's, to a Westerner, we don't even hear our own lens of, sure, I'll go and talk to them one-on-one. That's the polite thing to do. In some cultures, that's really confronting. To say to someone, I see you've done this thing wrong and I want to talk it through with you lovingly. It's very direct and can be shaming, particularly a culture that really esteems the importance of faith. We've created space to talk about the difference between honor and shame cultures and how, for example, they use a go-between person or a go-between mediator. That is the person who is the one going to them.
And sometimes you don't even know that the go-between is actually, like, sometimes they do it so gently as to not offend you that you don't realize at first like what's happening. And it's like, because they bring it up so kind of non-confrontationally that it takes a while to be like, oh, I get it now. Yeah.
Look, I can tell you as a Westerner, there's been many attempts to resolve a conflict I've not even picked up on because I can't read nuance. I'm much more used to a direct communication style, which is another lens again. There's another hazard in the use of mediators, Brandi. One is that you might miss it, or maybe it's done well, as I think you were describing just then. But it also might feel escalating to a Westerner, because if they realize and tweak, oh, this is a mediator, why are they escalating to a mediator? They're going to someone else. So why didn't they just come and talk to me about it? And so being able to create a common understanding that some cultures use mediators as a way of that one-on-one conversation in the first place helps us to interpret in a different way and go, oh, this feels a bit uncomfortable, but I see the gesture and they're trying to restore peace between us and alert me to something that I'm not already aware of, and being grateful for that. In the Western context, when we think of mediation, it's a very formalized process and it's a way of holding people in a space that just can't make it work between them. And so if I think I'm entering mediation, it's usually an experience of something's gone wrong for a long time and I've needed help. But that's not the case for the majority world that use mediators much, much earlier. And so being able to just see that when we read something like Matthew 18 and recognize we have our own cultural lenses, even in how we read the Bible, then we can start to see why, when we come together in cross-cultural teams, we trip up when we're each trying to be good, right, and godly, because what that looks so different and feels so different for each person in the room.
And I like what you said about we're trying to be good, right, and godly. Like, I think about the cultures who use mediators. Well, they're doing it so it's not to shame you. And so they're not doing it to, like, get a gang to try to gang up on you or anything like that. They're doing it to show respect. And then our way of showing respect could come across very differently to them and very harsh to them. So I appreciate the balanced perspective of understanding, what's valued in this culture, what's valued in this culture, and taking the step to stand back and want to appreciate and expect the best out of them and in their intentions too.
Yeah, I love that assumption of believing the best. I don't do it naturally. And when I'm reminded as a practice to go back to that, it's very corrective and healing. And helps me to notice my own challenges when I'm feeling a bit confronted and what does believing the best mean in this moment when I have this sinking feeling in my chest or this tendency to want to defend myself. What am I reacting to, and what could I tell myself differently about what's going on and soften in that? And my walk with Christ is so important because I need to know I'm held by him first, and then I can trust the situation or trust him in the situation to be able to reach for something a bit bigger than I'm first able to imagine.
I always think of the 4 principles from Dwayne Elmer's book, Cross-Cultural Servanthood. Talks about like suspending judgment and tolerating ambiguity, thinking gray, positive attribution, which is what you were just talking about. Is sometimes we actually do the negative attribution. We jump to a potential negative outcome of why this is happening to us or why this person had done this to us. I think in my role as a counselor, a very frequent thing that I'm doing is actually helping people consider another perspective. But what if that person wasn't trying to get you? What if they're having a really hard day? Or what if they thought they were doing the right thing? Oh, I hadn't thought of that. Oh, I hadn't thought of that. What if they didn't cut you off because they're a terrible person, but they just had a really hard conversation and weren't looking in the rearview mirror? All these things that helping people get to that place. Because I think when it comes especially to conflict, our emotions get raised, which means we're not actually using our prefrontal cortex, which is really important to think well and make good decisions. So now we're emotionally activated. We're out of our window of tolerance. And that's actually when we need the most access to our whole self to be able to navigate that well.
And the Holy Spirit's help in that. Is in what you were just saying, James, I'm noticing that we are each very different and very similar all at once. We've got very different cultural assumptions about this is how we do it right or get things done. But there's something very similar in that we're very human and we have bad days and get stressed and are a bit abrupt or can be offensive without meaning to be. And if we have someone on the other side who's willing to approach me from a place of grace and realize in my heart, I'm not trying to be hard-hearted towards you, I'm just a bit prickly today, then a lot of good can be achieved through that. I think that's where the training's really helpful, that by creating some spaces where we reflect on we're different but the same, and it's like a different language, except that it's behavioral and maybe postural from a cultural perspective, and to create more awareness of this is what some different postures can look like. But actually, as we've been adjusting the content of the training to make that space, I still have a script that's not finished and we're rolling it out. I just ran one last week. And I was convicted by the thought, I'm not meant to have a finished script. I'm meant to keep a question mark about what we're doing and saying, we're still learning. We still need to hear from everyone in the room. Is this your understanding of what a definition of conflict is or how this passage could be applied? Tell us. We want to hear your perspective. Now, that's problematic in itself because an Australian will pop up and go, oh, well, it looks like this for me. But someone from the Southeast Asian culture needs all the other appropriate people in the room to answer first and then to be invited in. So it's been a real journey for me to think about if I really want to participate in a way that allows each perspective to be honored and included and to feel and know that their perspective is so valuable, I need to be inviting people in a way that makes sense to their worldview. So I've had to, with my team, think about how do we use this space well to honor our organization's time so that people are invited in to share, well, what are the problems with someone with higher status apologizing and asking for forgiveness? Because they're dishonoring the role. That's what it feels like to do that. And for me as an Australian, like, why wouldn't you as a leader demonstrate and lead by apologizing us for forgiveness? But there's a whole lot of consequences that come with that. And I needed to hear that from my colleagues to understand that what I'm presuming to be a godly response isn't in that context. And so we need time and space to hear those stories and dilemmas so that we can sit with them together. And if there's nothing I want people to take more, apart from the foundation of the gospel in this training, it's that we don't have the answers and we go in not knowing the answers, asking, can you help me understand your perspective so that we can honor God by the way we've resolved this particular issue between us.
I wonder, when you're doing the training, are you finding pretty good variety in the cultures who are participating together?
Yeah. One of the complicating factors, as we found even for this interview, is just making a time that brings people together, that people are awake for. So we do.
Yep.
That's been a huge challenge. but we offer it in different time zone regions. So we often get
Mm-hmm.
a bunch of people from Asia Pacific or from Africa, Europe, and then the Americas. But there's often a wide variety of people who live within the same time pockets. Yeah. We did an in-person a couple of months ago, and so people were flying in from lots of places. So that was quite a mixed group. And it was interesting to see it play out in person rather than on a Zoom screen as well. It meant that the people were talking with each other informally a lot more, which that's the challenge of Zoom, of course. Just to elaborate my thinking there, I have had one group recently where we had fewer first culture country variety, like it was much more Western who was in the call. It was much simpler to deliver the material, but it felt a bit empty because I didn't have the tension of other people saying, but you haven't thought of this. And I really appreciate the tension that comes up when there's an objection or a counterpoint that we need to integrate. And that I think is a much more helpful experience during the training.
Do you find in the training that there are things that people understand about their own cultures, and they understand that they bring these aspects of their cultures and relationships, but then there are things that we don't realize about ourselves, and maybe some things we're very, very quick to recognize, but then other things takes a lot more work and a lot more introspection to be aware of it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly some of the issues that we want to make more apparent to people in their training. There's two different metaphors we use. One you've probably heard is that a fish doesn't see the water that it's swimming in, and culture is the water that we just exist in, that informs what being polite looks like and efficient and valuable, until you move to a new culture, and then some of those things become much more apparent. But I think when we're working cross-culturally, particularly when we share a faith, there's still some assumptions that we think carry through that. And of course there are, because that's what forms the organization. And so that's when we hit conflict, we realize there's a few more differences than we'd picked up when we just entered a new country.
You brought up this example earlier about conflict, and that how different cultures can see the biblical way of dealing with conflict, and they have these assumptions that their way is the biblical way. And I wonder if you see that in other areas too, of people interacting cross culture, where they bring these cultural assumptions that they just kind of overlay biblical assumptions on top of that well, it must be right, this is what we do in our culture, and so therefore this is how we should do it.
I think I've probably come across those conversations mostly in the training itself. What I have noticed more, Brandi, is the dominance that Western thinking tends to bring into these conversations, and the people from majority world countries are much more gracious. They've tolerated that experience for a long time. They know how to see, oh, this is this mindset and this is how I operate in it. And so it's been refreshing to pull that back a little bit and allow them to speak a little bit more freely. And in that, I've learned all sorts of really interesting things. I had a conversation with someone a couple of weeks ago in an Eastern African culture where mediators, the go-between mediators, are used a lot. And his comment was, yeah, we use them all the time. I think too much. It's really inefficient, because every time I need to talk to my dad, my uncle comes and talks to me. And so I saw some of the hazards the other way that I wouldn't normally be alert to. And I'm not sure that he comes, or people from that practice come with this is the biblical way of doing it. It's just what's comfortable and familiar and how we do it. And they're skilled and they recognize it when it's happening. And when we name the teaching in the Bible together with all those different cultures present in the conversation, it's so interesting to hear those perspectives, because and we actually set this premise up at the beginning of the training, is to recognize that we are meeting together to learn how to resolve conflict biblically, and we're taking the time to understand different cultural perspectives, which takes a bit of effort. But the other culture doesn't trump the way we resolve conflict. It helps us to be more sensitive. But ultimately, the Bible critiques culture, which means there might be times when what I find comfortable is actually a helpful expression. An example of that is in many indirect cultures, it can be unhelpful to not name what's going on, and people leave the interaction not really clear. Like, I can tell I'm forgiven, but I think that's going to happen again, and I'm not sure if they're still upset about this until it circles back. And so that's where our skills in being able to use I language and soft startup and perhaps, and have you considered really soft language, we're very practiced at that. And we do have something to offer to a culture that doesn't name things clearly, but to be very gentle and tender, understanding that as we invite people into a more direct interaction that might be something you're responding to because they can see the Bible invites us to that, to be doing that gently and understanding this is not something they've had as much practice. Their culture hasn't given them a lot of that kind of those experiences through their formative years.
Yeah, it's so important for it to happen in the context of when you're not in the conflict, talking through how are you going to navigate such a thing. It's much more helpful when we're fully regulated.
Yeah.
Well, and a lot of time, cross-cultural workers, they spend the majority of their time without margin, and living at the edge of what is viable, or at the what am I thinking? What's the zone, James? I'm doing this in my head. What's the top part of the
Comfort
zone?
zone?
Yeah, the zone
Neutral
of,
zone.
not the neutral zone. What's the top part of the I feel like we're playing charades here. Yes. So we're
No.
retired and we're spent and we're operating at our margins, and so we're not at our best at being able to understand what's going on in ourselves, what's going on with the people we're working with. And that's a lot of hand motion on my part, but so I can see there's so much benefit in doing some of this hard work before even going on the field and taking the time to understand what we bring of ourselves and our culture.
That's been one of my questions, is at what point do we engage in these conversations as a whole organization? And we actually make time for that question with people who go through the training, and all sorts of things come up, including how do we get this into orientation? We want people to come with a common understanding, but I don't think that's enough. I think it needs to be a revolving conversation that we keep meeting back into. So as I've been coordinating the rollout of the program, I can see that having everyone attend the training isn't enough to bring us towards building a culture of peace. It's the starting point that we have this common understanding, but we need to be in conversations with one another in different ways. So how do we create this space? And as you're reflecting back the things I've been saying, I'm realizing how important it is to be able to calm down and talk from at our arm's length about what's happening, and to create those spaces regularly so we can observe, because we learn as we're in the culture. You can orient people all you like, but they'll forget 90% before they get on the field, and then there's so much lived experience to build on. So just being patient with, I'm not trying to get data and say, look how helpful this program is. It's about how do we get this into the conversation so that we are sharing a vision towards building these practices and postures together that honor Christ in many different cultural perspectives, which ultimately is a beautiful thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is.
I think where you were leading in with Jeff's conversation about how we've been so focused at preventing attrition that we've missed out what we should be doing is helping people thrive and be healthy. And it sounds like that's really what you're talking about in terms of conflict. Is it's probably the wrong posture to be so motivated toward conflict resolution and prevention, as opposed to really being postured towards being people of peace. And it's an attitude, it's a mindset, but it's also kind of a goal and a hope that we have. If we are pursuing peace with one another, then we will find it, as opposed to just trying to get the skills we need to navigate conflict well. We're missing on what the whole point is. We're actually facing towards the wrong thing.
Yeah, we're getting distracted by a program instead of turning to the person of Christ.
Yeah, I like
not the programs are bad.
No.
I like the term you used earlier, Steph. You said conflict incompetent, which can span a whole range of behavior. And I like the idea of it's not the avoidance of conflict, but it's wanting to lean into understanding other perspectives too, and understanding what your perspective has done to other people, how it's impacted other people, and how you can better understand the people you're working with.
You're reminding me of one of the first teaching principles in the program, if you don't mind me stepping into trainer mode.
Do it.
And so it talks about conflict offering us opportunities. Actually, it acknowledges that not all conflict is bad, even though it's very uncomfortable. And those three opportunities are, firstly, to glorify God. Secondly, that I might love the other person. And thirdly, that I might grow more like Christ. And can you hear in that how there's spiritual formation in that even as I enter something that is confronting or jarring, or I get my defenses up, or I'm stressed, as you were saying, Brandi, and just to be alert, this is the moment I need to just check in with what those opportunities are. And they're often worded as questions, so that I can ask myself in a quiet moment, am I honoring God in my response? And of course, the first knee jerk is no. But what does honoring look like? What do I need to do next that might help me with that? I might need to step away, pray, talk with a friend who I trust. something that just slows me down so I can think a bit more clearly? Maybe go to some scripture that's helpful in this. And then, am I loving the other person? Can I posture myself so that I can be ready to do some, to seek their good? And that's going to take a little bit of work on my part. I'm going to have to pray and think about what I'm upset about or that's threatened. And then to be asking myself, how am I growing more like Christ in this? How am I letting him form me? That is the opposite posture for me when I'm feeling threatened, to be that vulnerable, willing to be reformed. And that's why I love delivering this training, because it slows people down and invites them into some spiritual formation. It's not just head knowledge. The gospel is doing its work again and again as we consider how we participate well in building peace.
I would say that spiritual formation is happening regardless, but it's helpful to attend to make sure that it's helpful and healthy spiritual formation. Conflict forms us.
Yeah, not malformation.
That's right. We are indeed being formed in the midst of conflict.
That's right. Yeah, and we carry those wounds and misshapings with us, don't we? And it impacts future directions.
And I appreciate what you said earlier, Steph, about how, how we interact as team members and cross-cultural workers impacts the people we're trying to impact. And they see us, they see how we're interacting, and it really, we keep saying the word effect and impact, which I need a different word, but it's important. It's important because they're watching, and they're watching how we love each other. I think it's good to remember that.
Oh, you're just going to the verse that started it all for me, which is, they will know that you're my disciples by the love you have for one another. And this is one of the ways to live that out.
I think I talk a lot about having something plastered on our forehead. And I think that's another thing we need to have plastered on our forehead. It's really important.
Kind of the crux of my my studies right now is really about that, because for people to be safe, what we're sort of seeking is connection, but trauma in particular disrupts connection. So to be able to navigate to those places, it's important to be attentive to that. And I think what will come out of my research most likely is a program on emotional intelligence.
Oh, that's exciting, James.
Yeah, because I feel like that's the gap for navigating organizations that are living organisms of trauma histories. But we'll save that for another time.
Yeah, I want to hear that podcast.
Yeah. I'll send you the finished paper in another 1.5 years. It'll be much longer than you want to read.
Read the abstract and the conclusions.
That's right.
Yeah.
Steph, it's been great to have you here. And I just wonder if you could go ahead and tell us how to get in touch with you, how to find your resources, or any other resources that you would have, or suggestions you would have, especially for churches or organizations that are preparing their people to go overseas.
Yeah, thanks, James. Well, I've mentioned The Peacemaker by Ken Sande. His surname is Sande. But I would just caution readers to consider that that was written for a Western audience, and to make that part of your repertoire, but not the whole gamut. And I think globally we're walking together and learning how to have those conversations. I've mentioned Peacewise. So their website is peacewise.org.au. It's an Australian biblical peacemaking training organisation, but they are delivering globally. The program that I've been describing has been a unique expression of that to our organisation, but I'm sure that if they hear from you, they'll be very interested to explore that, if you were interested to explore those options with them. And I have my own little resource that James is aware of, called the Cultural Values Cards. I'll show you, Brandi, but obviously you can't see it on a podcast. So that's just a line with individualism on the left and collectivism on the right, with some graphics, and then on the back there are definitions about the ends. And you can see James' top is right there. And that's the first card in about 15. And it's just a tool of bringing forward research that are different ways of seeing different worldviews and making it more explicit. And that's part of helping us observe ourselves and observe the people around us. And so I've used that in training, preparing people for going overseas. And if you're interested in those cards, feel free to contact me on stephanie.schwartz at sim.org, which I'm sure will be in the show notes, Brandi.
It will. James does the show notes, so yes, it will.
That's right.
Thanks for joining us today, Steph. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
I've enjoyed it. Had fun. Thank you.
Brandi, you
sure.
might want to move your mic just a little closer.
Like this.
Oh,
Yes,
yes.
actually.
Oh,
That's
actually.
way better. Brandy's on the phone, so I hope she puts this in the extras at the end. Can't believe, Brandi, you're on the phone. Unbelievable.
This training teaches a biblical. Blah. And obviously, James and I are both American and both Texans, so that's like 2 strikes right there.
That's like
But-
worse. Yeah.
Steph,
Brandi has to edit, so I don't mind.
he's relaxing. He's just fine.